Okay, welcome to this first video of Module 1. This is where it all starts. It doesn't matter if you are trying to break free of the paycheck cycle, eliminate debt, or consistently save money for things that are really important to you. It all starts here with one simple lesson, and that is we must consistently earn more than we spend. Or put the other way, we can't spend more than we earn. This is the golden rule of money management. And this first module is going to be all about helping you establish a budget and consistently spend less than you earn. In the previous module, we went through and looked at our 5-step cascade, our roadmap to financial peace. Now the water, if you remember in that cascade, so step 1 was our surplus. We can only have a surplus every month if we are consistently spending less than we earn. That surplus is needed then to fill that first pool, bank account equals budget. It's then needed to build our rainy day fund. It's then needed to eliminate debt. So this video is going to be all about how do I set up a budget, or what does a good budget look like? And this story will start with the lessons I learned from my grandma, who taught me to budget using physical glass jars and physical money. My grandma taught me to budget using glass jars. So what she would do is she would walk to the post office every payday. She would then come home from the post office as soon as she got home, and she would take down 5 glass jars from her kitchen cupboard. Now, I don't exactly remember what her categories were, or how much she allocated to each category. Remember, this was 25 years ago. But what I do know is she had 1 glass jar per major expense in her household. Now, you can see here that I've got a glass jar for rates, I've got a glass jar for electricity, a glass jar for gas, a glass jar for the milkman, and finally, one thing I do know that my grandma had was a housekeeping jar. And the housekeeping jar is where she put her money for things like the groceries and for buying clothes and all those sorts of incidentals that go with running a household. And so every time Grandma would go to the post office, she'd collect her pay, she would come home, and the very first thing she would do would be to place money into each of these jars, so that when those bills turned up, the money was sitting there to pay them. Now, it was a really simple system. She would put money into the jar, and if she didn't spend it that month, it would accumulate. So for things like the bills where you have an annual bill or a quarterly bill or a half-yearly bill, the money would accumulate month on month on month, so to get more stuffed with money until that bill turned up, and then she would take it out and she would pay that bill. So she always knew exactly how much money she had, and she knew she had those bills covered so that when they turned up, the money was sitting there to pay them. Now with her housekeeping money, typically that was money she allocated for the month, and then at the end of the month it was all spent. Now the principles that I learnt from this are very simple. The first thing is that my grandma knew what all of her expenses were, and this is where a lot of people fall down with their budgeting today, is that they really don't know what all their expenses are. It's easy to identify the major bills, but where we fall short is when we think about, well, how much do I spend on clothes? How much do I spend on gifts? How much do I spend on holidays and sports and hobbies and those sorts of things? So identifying what all your expenses are up front is super, super important. Now, my grandma was able to do that. Obviously, she did this for something like 80 years. But she knew what all her expenses were, and at the end of each year, she tweaked it. She knew what they were, and she knew how much she needed to allocate to each expense. So that's the next thing, is firstly, she knew what her expenses were. Secondly, she knew exactly what she had to put in each jar so that when that expense turned up, there was money left to pay it. Now, the third thing that she made sure of, and this is super important and something we seem to have forgotten today, is that she could only allocate to the jars what she had in cold hard cash. So she'd come home with her pay, she would know exactly how much she needed to put in each jar, but she knew that she couldn't put more in the jars than she had in physical cash. So that is that simple golden rule that we can't spend more than we earn. So for my grandma, at the end of each pay, she put her money in there and she would always have some money left over. And that is so very important. You can't spend more than you earn and get ahead financially. Sure, we can use debt for a while, credit cards and redraws on our home loans and so on. For a little while, we can get away with that. But long term, you're just creating a bigger hole for yourself. So if you stick to the simple principle that I can only allocate what I've got, then you'll go a long way. So for my grandma, she would know exactly how much she had left every pay after she topped up her jars, and then she would take that spare money and she would put it in the bank. Now that's 3 very important principles. The next 2 principles are again very simple, and they were that she couldn't spend more than she actually had allocated to the jars. So grandma could take money out of that, she could go pay the bills, or in the case of housekeeping, she could pay for discretionary expenses like her groceries or clothes and so on, but she could not spend more than she allocated to the jars. So it's a very important rule in that when you've set the boundary for how much you're going to allocate, you cannot spend more than you've accumulated. And the last thing that was very important was you couldn't take from one full jar to pay for an expense from another jar because you'd run out in that other jar. So it was a very simple system that my grandma taught me, and it is the basis for everything that we do at Grandma's Jars today. Now, we don't use glass jars anymore. In fact, we've got our Grandma's Jars budgeting applications which have been built on these very simple principles. So what I want you to take away from this is the principles of budgeting are really very simple. You just need a system then to use it. Now I still know people that don't necessarily use glass jars, but they use envelopes to do the same sort of thing. I know people that use paper budgets to keep track of what they're spending and what they're allocating every month. But obviously we've got applications out there that we can use as well. Now this is the first of these budgeting video tutorials, how to budget. What I'm going to go through over the next 4 or 5 videos, exactly how you put these principles into practice in a world of online bank accounts and virtual budgets. It was easy for Grandma. She had the physical glass jar, which is a boundary, and she had physical money in that glass jar. So she always knew where she was up to. But these days with credit cards, PayWave, PayPal, all those sorts of things, it can be very hard to stay on top of where your money's at. So what I want to talk to you about in the next few videos is how do we put it all together in our far more complicated world.